Hello everyone, welcome to the Australian Centre of the Moving Image, Australia's home of screens, cool stuff that happens on screens. We are your music panel. We're going to talk about what the future looks like for music and musicians and music lovers. Who likes music in this room? Yay! Well, that's a relief, otherwise we are in the wrong spot.
Who doesn't like music, maybe?
Who prefers other art forms? I really hope you've had an amazing day and a half so far. And, you know, this is the music panel, so we're a bunch of rock stars. We're going to make it super fun for you as you're coming off that post-lunch digestion situation. So before we get into it, I'm going to introduce myself and then we're all going to introduce ourselves. My name's Tim Shiel. I am based here on Wurundjeri country. It's where I live and where I work. I always try and keep in mind that in all the different things I do, my practice is only building on and an extension of people who have lived here for tens of thousands of years, and I personally still have so much to learn from the original cultures that have existed on this continent for that long. And I pay my respects to any First Nations people who are here and to Wurundjeri elders, past and present. I am a recovering ABC employee. Shout out to me. I worked at Triple J and Double J for 10 years as a presenter on Triple J's experimental music program Something More and on Double J's afternoon program, imaginatively called Arvos. I'm also a musician and I'm currently actually working with Green Music Australia, which is the climate non-for-profit for the music sector, because it turns out there is actually a lot of work to do at that intersection. So I'm currently the community organiser for that group. I've also worked in video games. My kids are thrilled that one of the games I worked on was in the ACMI exhibition for a bit. It's not there anymore because Untitled Goose Game kicked it out. I don't know if Ginny's here, I've got a bone to pick, but yes, that's me in a nutshell, but I have 3 actual doctors here who will now introduce themselves as well. Ollie.
Thanks, Tim. So hi everyone, great to be here. I've been really enjoying myself so far. Hope we can keep that going. My name's Ollie Bown. I'm an associate professor at the School of Art and Design at UNSW in Sydney. I'm the co-director of the Creative Technologies Research Lab. And what we do is we have fun with creative technologies and we explore and we experiment and we play. But increasingly we critically examine how their impacts are rolling out in society, and no guesses for what area of focus has been central to that in recent years. So my interest in creative AI goes back a very long way and is constantly evolving, as I'm sure everyone else is.
Me?
Yes, please.
I love that you called me a real doctor, because I do have a PhD in curatorial practice, but my my dad is actually was a doctor. He's a retired doctor, and he said I'm not a real doctor. So yeah, so I'm working at RMIT in the School of Media and Communication. I'm just coming to the end of a postdoctoral fellowship there. Been researching there for 3 years on a project called Machine Listening, which is really about, you know, holding sort of sound, audio listening against artificial intelligence, machine learning, platformization, thinking about what it means to live in a world full of always-on listening devices, but also, you know, what it means to make music in a world like that. And music has always been a really important part of my life as a kind of, you know, fanatical, you know, follower of the live music scene. Growing up in the 90s in Melbourne, you know, with Triple J in its heyday, maybe you could say, and like the community radio stations, Triple R, PBS, 3CR, etc. It was kind of easy as a teenager to know about all ages punk shows that were happening around the corner from where you lived. So all of that was really formative for me. And yeah, for 10 years prior to being an academic at RMIT, I was the artistic director of an organisation called Liquid Architecture, which is Liquid Architecture fan in the audience, which is a long-running, kind of against all the odds, it's been around for about 25 years, Australian-based organisation with a focus on sonic art, experimental music and so forth. So kind of on the fringes of the music industry proper in a certain sense, but nevertheless, yeah, a great musical education for me in that organisation.
And Christen, this isn't your first time up on the stage.
I know.
So far.
I was here yesterday. I was sitting over there, I think. Yes, I am also a doctor, which I feel a bit fraudulent about, but what it means, and I didn't describe this yesterday, actually. I said that I was in the research team at Creative Australia, which is still true, but my role is managing research partnerships. And what that means is I get to work with a lot of people in academia, other doctors, and people who have really kind of specialist expertise, as well as through research partnerships with the sector, with industry. So yeah, today I'm talking about a bunch of those that we have on music. There's a real recognition, I think, at Creative Australia and also with the establishment of Music Australia, that the music industry is going through a time of significant change. There are a number of disruptions, and we're looking at them through a series of research reports that started last year looking at music festivals. We're at the moment doing a big piece of research on audiences, what they want, both in live, but also how they find music, discoverability. There's a disruption there around kind of streaming that I guess we might talk about, and other things to do with live music and climate and insurance.
Insurance,
and
strap in.
and one final thing to the intro, which is we do this survey, big piece of research at Creative Australia every 3 years called our National Arts Participation Survey, and music is far and away the most accessed art form.
Yep.
All those tracked there. Yeah.
And without going too deep on this now, it is really exciting to see more research being done into how music functions in reality. Because I think, speaking as an artist, I think artists and creative workers for a long time have been trying to navigate a really precarious industry / community and sector. So, you know, having more people, trained researchers trying to pick apart how it's actually working and what the models could look like in the future is so important. Given that this is the home of screens, is that ACMI's slogan? Have I got that Seb here? Home of screens? No. Can someone put the screen of my laptop up there? There you go. Welcome to my world. I'm going to do my best not to show you my email or anything like that, but I do always ask in this situation, if you do see anything, just please don't steal my identity. You don't want it. Just let me be me. Let me be me, please. I want to put this up here because I'm going to help it. I'm going to put some prompts up here that are going to guide our conversation. So we are going to start with AI because we do have two AI big thinkers here. But I'm just going to say...
Bros.
We're going to talk about AI a bit because I'm always conscious that conversations about the future are just dominated by... A lot of them are dominated by AI at the moment, particularly in the creative fields. So to ensure that we don't go overboard, I'm going to... It's very low tech, I guess, in this context, but I'm going to put an alarm on my phone. What does everyone reckon about... I'm going to say 12 minutes to start, or 10 maybe? 10 or 12. I know you're disappointed, Ollie, but I'm going to give us...
Got a lot of notes here.
I'm going to give us 10. AI will come up because we'll talk about other things and you can work it in.
I love talking about music, any kind of music.
My phone's going to buzz in 10 minutes, so we can snooze it a couple of times if we're in the thick of it. So, Ollie, talking to you, you told me that the last 12 months was like a breakthrough year for AI and how musicians use it and how it works in the creative context. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I'd probably say like 23, 24, just so much happened that it had everyone scrambling. Breakthroughs maybe not the word I want to use because there's just so much concern and we want to step back from the great big tech breakthrough that's going to save the world. We were just having a discussion just before we started about the fact that there are still narratives very dominant in the startup sector that's coming to AI that talk about democratization. They talk about the idea that, you know, in a couple of years' time, everyone will be able to create music without effort, without limit, without, you know, any limit to their expression. And then at the same time, we've got this kind of huge outcry going on with professional musicians primarily panicking about the copyright impact on their work. but a wider sort of moral angst about where this is all heading. And I'm sure most people are familiar with those discussions. I mean, just to throw in a couple of more specific topics that I've got interested in, because we could talk about copyright all day, but these narratives of value have become a particularly important focus because when you get into the scholarly research on what music is and why we value it, there's a lot to unpack, and talking about democratization immediately just kind of begs more questions than it answers. So one of my research focus areas has been to understand what it is people actually want when they create, and creation as an act of for the sake of it, an end in itself, and not a means to an end of the output of the creative object which you go and sell. So we have to constantly battle to escape the sort of economic-centric narrative of thinking about creative production, even though, of course, we also have to have very practical discussions around what it means economically and how we power our creative world, creative sector. But we also just really have to step back and understand what it is we do when we create. And so I'm looking at, one thing I'm looking at is a value-centered approach to what these commercial organizations are doing when they're trying to design interfaces. One of the things that's happened is that the expressive nature of the interface has been erased. We typically think of creative software as being these open-ended surfaces that we can move things around on and stuff, and now we're looking at them at these kind of narrow tubes that we sort of push prompts through. Now they're being innovated every day, so the design space is changing, and we see very interesting design innovation where we've got prompt text to audio, text to music interfaces integrated with other types of interface where you can feed in inputs and paint something in, take something out, manage prompts in different ways. That's starting to get really interesting, and there will be a fascinating revolution in AI-generated music that's highly creative and that's still highly human. And then there's going to be a lot of other things that are happening right now, such as completely shifting markets of music, particularly the functional music space, the space where, say, someone puts on music in a restaurant or in a massage parlor, and that's being served without the artist, without any interest in who the artist is, and it's just there for functional reasons. And that's one particular space amongst many where music markets can be highly altered over time through different market forces. I know Joel's going to want to talk a bit about that as well. So I've already taken up how many minutes?
No, we're good. We got we've got 6 minutes left.
All right.
You're just talking there around. So you're maybe referring to things like Endel, for example, or so services that can provide AI-generated music, as opposed to, in the past, they might have paid a license fee for a real musician or worked with a composer. That idea of like a frictionless experience and a decontextualized music experience is something that I think about a lot with Spotify. It feels like in the most dystopian telling of this, people's relationship with music really has changed, because now so many people are using platforms like Spotify who have aggressively removed context in terms of where is a song from, who is the artist, what's the context for the piece. It's interesting to think about that. If they've started that trend towards priming a music-loving audience to be decontextualized, does then AI pick up that baton and make it worse, for want of a better, more nuanced word?
Yeah, or actually the other way around, that Spotify, for all of its ills, is there doing one thing, and as these startups come along and sort of shift that landscape, they're actually driving change in the giant services, all of the incumbents.
Didn't Spotify poach the French AI researcher who was doing the Beatles years ago? There was like
Francois Pachot,
yeah. But what's he working on?
Well, he left Spotify, and
right.
he was working briefly on creator tools, because Spotify had this thing called, was it called Songkick? No, that's something completely different.
Sound Better?
Sorry, it was an online workstation, and Spotify were interested in developing a sort of end-to-end service where they were serving more of the artistic creation process as well as the distribution. I don't know where that's got to, but I think that they possibly have refocused their interests. And they are very much in the spotlight. So I think now's a very critical time for us to be making noise about what we do and don't want in musical culture.
Does anyone like jazz? Who likes jazz? Who likes John Coltrane? Maybe familiar with a track called Giant Steps? It's an iconic piece from the history of contemporary music, and I'm going to play it for us now. Please enjoy. Joel, if I may, given this has kind of already opened the floodgates, what the fuck are we listening to, Joel?
That's a good question. I mean, you introduced it accurately. We're listening to John Coltrane's Giant Steps, the classic jazz record. I mean, yeah, can you hear me over the top of this? Is it okay? Not really?
Oh, maybe we can. Why don't I stop it?
All right. I mean, you can listen to the whole thing. It goes for 7 minutes, and it's worth it. It gets better. I mean, this is a record that I recently worked on with a couple of colleagues. Sean Dockery, who's in the audience up there, James Parker. We work under the name Machine Listening. Songs About Fucking Suno is the name of the record. We're streaming it off Bandcamp, which is the better stream, is the good guys to Spotify's sort of ultra villainy, you could say. I think we should, it's depressing. We've already had to talk about Spotify so much. We should precy any conversation about them by acknowledging, how ultra damaging the Spotification of music has been in so many ways. This record has a rather niche reference to the Big Black album Songs About Fucking, a kind of classic post-punk industrial noise record of the 80s, with the same brat green cover. Didn't have the emoji. That was our invention. Some of you might know this record, and Big Black was led by an extremely ideological figure in punk music, Steve Albini, who was one of the first people to really properly theorise what it meant to be an independent artist in the context of the commercial music industry, the way that artists could protect themselves against exploitation from major labels, unfair licensing agreements getting ripped off, etc., etc. So in some ways, our record, Songs About Fucking Suno, is an attempt to apply a similar kind of anti-capitalist critique to the context of AI-generated music, I suppose. So now I'll answer your question about what we were listening to, if you like. So Suno, I'm not sure if you mentioned Suno by name, but one of the reasons why AI and music is kind of trending in 2024, 2025, or the last year or whatever, is the launch of these generative AI music platforms, Suno being the major one, I think launched in late 2023, Udio being the other, where just like Midjourney or DALL-E or whatever, you use a text prompt interface to generate a fully formed piece of music. And unlike AI music of the past that was sort of really glitchy and messed up and sounded like some Frankenstein construction that would never really pass as listenable music, Suno and Udio, Suno's up to version 4 now, is already producing work that is is not good, but it's passable in the functional music space, which are 3 of the most depressing words you could ever hold together in a way. So our album is kind of like a critical exploration of the Suno platform. We used Suno to generate songs about Suno in a way to kind of like, it's almost like a Brechtian thing where like we're trying to like alienate AI music from itself by kind of using it to create some critical distance. Giant Steps, John Coltrane is often held up as the sort of apotheosis of creative human musical expression. So the idea of creating an AI version of Coltrane was, kind of, I suppose, a form of provocation. What you're actually hearing there is a choir of generative voice clones, so voices that have been synthetically produced from extracting acoustic qualities of other people's voices. There's a Bob Dylan clone in there, there's a Cat Powell one without permission, but and they are mimicking the saxophone solo from Giant Steps. And my background is in sort of, avant-garde and experimental music. And so I just want to sort of say there's a whole trajectory in the 20th century avant-garde about automation, like going back to surrealist automatic writing and Fluxus, the event score, and, the idea that you can just, have an engine of production that is not the human creativity but some machinic process. And so I think these tools have quite a lot of potential in that space of avant-garde automation. But just the flip side of that is the kind of dissolution of the human agency and subjectivity in a way. And I'll just maybe end my little rant here on a recent interview with the Suno CEO, Mikey Schulman is his name, and all these guys that run these platforms, they come from industries like financial services and AI sort of tools. It's not like they're people who care about music and musicians. And he said that the great thing about Suno, is that it democratizes music making, and the reason, because it makes it so easy to make music, you just type in a text prompt. And the reason why that's great is because, in his view, most people find making music really unpleasant because you've got to learn an instrument or learn how to use a piece of software, and that's really unpleasant and frustrating and hard and, whatever. So this is the antidote to make it so easy that the horror of having to actually make music gives way to the joy of having it made for you. And on that note, we've done the AI bit. But you said someone said to try to do AI with optimism, so I'm not sure. Sorry.
Yeah, I think before we do move on, although I think we will return to, we can't talk about now and the future without keep coming back to AI, because it is monstrous. If we could wake up tomorrow morning, a lot of people are calling for not just regulation, but I think some people are so, not just frightened, but they're so just unsure that people would love a moratorium on a lot of this stuff. If you are both really enjoying playing with the tools as creative makers as well as researchers, that comes through when you speak about it, Joel, yourself just then, and the results are fun. So how do we balance the fact that this shit is fun versus what might be these kind of moral quandaries, and on top of that, environmental concerns, because we haven't even really discussed, and it seems to be absent from the narrative around AI mostly, the great compute and therefore great environmental and water cost that any of this requires. As it's a personal question, I guess, but as creators, how do you balance that?
I'll do my bit on the environmental cost really, really quickly. Tax fossil fuels. It's like Bitcoin, or it's like YouTube. It's like any energy producing activity that you engage in your life. You can have a moral stance. I'm not going to do that. I'm never going to fly to England. I'm never going to watch YouTube videos. At the end of the day, it has to be globally, a global centralized response. I mean, massive topic. That's all I want to say. But back to the other dimensions of AI. I'm paper chair of the AI Music Creativity Conference next year, so I go and look at academic work in innovating new AI technologies. I'm still completely in that space, but doing what I can, and with amazing teams, including the Music AI European Research Council funded project Music and Artificial Intelligence, which tries to bring critical debates into engineering environments, because that's one of the critical things we have to do, is the kinds of cultures that Joel just referred to. We have the potential to sort of shift the moral thinking around someone who graduates from computer science and goes to work for a company. It's got to happen at every level, but of course it's got to happen at the regulation level. Very, very quickly on that note, we're potentially in a positive place in Australia, because we've had this Parliamentary Senate Committee report on adopting AI, and they were absolutely unequivocal that the claims, it's worth looking at. If you go and look at the submissions by big tech, Google, Meta, etc., they brazenly state that we must have the freedom to hoover up everyone's data, because how else would we support minority cultures being represented in these data sets? That's literally what they say. Go read it. And thankfully, the Select Committee uses the word farcical to describe that, and that's in the report. So that's yet to go to anything creating legislation, but we have some reason to be optimistic that debate's going in the right direction. But of course, globally, which is what really matters, because these companies don't often come from Australia or operate in Australia. We obviously have to follow the global sort of consensus, and that is emerging with some hope that we are going to protect artists from being scraped. And there'll probably be, I think, according to some of the papers I've been looking at recently, there will be a sort of consensus where there will be certain uses of data scraping that are allowed, because they're not disrupting the markets of the people that whose data is being scraped. So if you're training on literature by creative authors just in order to make your language model better at speaking English, that might be considered okay. But if it's then being used to generate literature, then that's a problem. And these are well established in fair use provisions. That's what the US copyright law states, is that there should be a reasonable approach to that. That's all I'll say on that, and hand over.
I mean, I think as artists, we always labour under contradictions, which are kind of irreconcilable. Like, you end up using platforms that you hate and technologies that are, damaging or unsustainable. But it is possible to have a critical relationship to technology. I mean, in the context of platformization of music, there has been a radical devaluation of content. It's like content is cheap. Daniel Ek said making music has never been cheaper, right? He said the cost of making music is almost zero, and that he's meant the cost to Spotify in harvesting people's music. He wasn't talking about the artistic labour of musicians. And so, one way of thinking about critical technology-based artistic practice is how to go beyond content and sort of work with the protocols and infrastructures in subversive and creative ways. And so, here I'm thinking about artists like Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst and Jennifer Walsh and people like that who you might be familiar with. That's what we try to do in the machine listening project too, to some degree. But then there's always the danger that when you're operating, let's say, on the kind of outer fringes of the, platform's aesthetic world, like trying to make weird shit on Suno, that really what you are simply doing is training Suno to have a more total recognition and understanding of even these sort of avant-garde fringes of its own sort of capacity. So there's that totalizing logic that the margins have to be cannibalized, by the algorithm, and that the avant-garde is simply the sort of, project to help move that along. It's rather tricky.
I forgot to mention at the start of the talk, but you guys are probably pretty well trained by this point. If you have any questions, you can use the Slido machine. We've got a question here. How do you spell Endel? I'm happy to do that. It's similar to this word, actually. In shootification, just a side note, great concept that was recently coined by Cory Doctorow, which you may or may not be familiar with if you want to kind of get a bit of a take on where the content platforms are headed and how they're working economically. It's a good take on it. But Endel is spelled like this, E-N-D-E-L. There we go. Very good, very good. Nice one, Eric. And yes, another question, which I'm loving. Is there any space for Christen to talk? Or is this AI Brofest? Well, that's why I set the alarm.
Yeah, I'm just not going to take on these guys on AI.
I followed
waiting patiently.
I neglected my own rules there, but I want to get into live music because anyone who even has a cursory eye on how music is functioning in Australia at the moment, you'll know that at least there is a lot of media and a lot of public sentiment around a live music crisis in Australia. And this involves some really high-profile festival cancellations. Splendour in the Grass saying that they're not going to run their event is similar to Coachella or Glastonbury saying, oh, we're going to give this year a miss. It sends shockwaves throughout the whole sector. But then also you have music venues continuing to struggle maybe with their business models. Some of it's COVID related, but some of it might not be. We luckily have Christen here who can speak to all this a lot more than I. Is this idea of a live music crisis overstating things in your opinion?
I think I'd say yes to that. I think when I kind of introduced myself, I was talking about significant disruption and adaptation required to manage these changing times, and like that is real. And some models aren't working, I guess, and we're seeing that. So we put out Soundcheck 1 at the beginning of last year, and that was the first kind of taking stock of festivals in Australia. And could you scroll down, please?
Absolutely.
And we'll show the map, because that map is so dinky. Anyway, it maps all the music festivals around the country, and you'd need to scroll further. There we are. 535 were mapped, and actually this project came to us before Splendour and Groove in the Mood last year started to cancel. So we didn't go into this thinking it's a crisis. We just went in to map these festivals and to better understand the logistical challenges of the festival operators. By the time it came out, they were like, media had a lot of attention to festivals for that reason, those cancellations. But yeah, the main barrier that was identified by the festival organisers was operational costs, and insurance was a really huge part of that. They were making it clear that they were feeling that they were taking on more and more risk, and that story continues. I think that is still very real today. But then we followed up with another report which went into a lot of those logistical challenges and other kind of conditions for putting on a festival by festival type, and it became really clear that it's a really uneven landscape. It's very diverse. There are large commercial festivals, there are small commercials. In fact, they're doing quite well, like the one-day electronic music events, they're fine. Some of the single genre festivals seem to be doing quite well. There are large not-for-profits, there are small not-for-profits, there are touring festivals, and they're responding to our questions about the challenges or the kind of success factors, the critical success factors in really different ways. And I think you can see that, right? Like since the media first started to feel great concern about festivals being over, and that was a very powerful narrative. I had friends say, well, now that music festivals are over, like, whoa. Some festivals have had their best season, they're selling out really, really quickly, Laneway, Meredith's, but then it's also interesting to look at why those ones are doing well. Is there something about a particular size of a festival that perhaps is appropriate? So yeah, that second report was starting to kind of look into those conditions, and then seeing that something that was shared actually across all festivals was this problem of people buying tickets later. And then you've got rising operational costs at the same time as cost of living crisis. So yeah, so I think I would say that some models are working, and even actually, I think, was it Splendid? No, it was Grooven. When they put out their statement recently, they said, we're looking for a sustainable model. We're looking to revise our model as we move into the future. This is why we're not going to hold it again this year. So there is a lot of that kind of study taking place within the festival industry. Some, though, that are still selling out really quickly, feeling that they're taking on significant risk because their margins are shrinking with those rising operational costs. And then there's a whole lot of new risk with climate events as well.
I was at a music festival last weekend, a 4-day music festival in Lutruwita, Tasmania, just outside of Launceston, called Party in the Paddock, where I saw Aurora and Empire of the Sun and Angie McMahon and Amel and the Sniffers. Massive, 12,000 people there. Festivals are not over.
Yeah.
But you mentioned rising insurance costs for festivals. and you touched on climate before. Is that what's the corollary there? Is that direct? Is the insurance completely to do with the risk of extreme weather, floods, heat, or is it more complicated than that?
I think who takes responsibility for cancellation is a real issue, and it takes some negotiation, and it's certainly not settled. But there is also risk in whether or not people are going to make enough money, I think.
Yeah. Do you think festivals and maybe music venues are incentivized to try new ideas? Because there can sometimes feel like there's a lack of imagination when it comes to how live music is presented. Like now that some things are having trouble, does this mean people will, instead of just trying to like make a new splendor happen?
Yeah, that was a response in the second soundcheck report, like how are you responding to these conditions? And they were trialling new models, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about it necessarily being incentivized at the moment, but there is this other research project which is with RMIT, Castrong, Ben Green, and also La Trobe, actually, Lauren Rickards and Todd Denham, and the Australian Festivals Association. So the AFA, we're all on this, and we're looking to bring music festivals together to workshop those kinds of ways of what is working for one and how another festival might learn from it. And some of that is about adapting and bringing new kind of models into play and potentially sharing resources. I think this is a big issue. So this research project, sorry, I don't think I was explicit, this is about festivals and climate disruptions. A lot of those, they're shared issues, and they are often issues of resources. And so bringing those festivals together in this project to collectively look at what's required for climate adaptation talks about like how might we address issues of how do you get water to all of these people in a temporary city? Could we share the kind of logistics around that? Or do we share sites rather than having festivals in all these different places? Are there particular sites where people go and hold a festival? Obviously that's problematic for some festivals because they're so place-based and it's all about the community. So I guess that is a project which is explicitly looking at climate disruptions and adaptations, which is looking to kind of find new models.
I think the same thing that frightens the music industry, the traditional, conventional music industry, is the thing that excites me, which is that we can't actually keep doing things the same way. We have to try new ways for all different sorts of reasons. I'm just thinking of part of my job at Green Music Australia is liaising with artists, but also different kinds of music organisations and companies to suss out what their approach to sustainability is and where their head is at in terms of climate change is a big issue, and just see what's possible. We're a tiny little hustling team doing that. I found myself in a merch company, a t-shirt, wholesaler essentially for the music business recently, and where I was getting along with this bloke really well. So I sort of pushed it a little bit by saying to him, in the context of what we're talking about here, mate, 10, 20 years, I kind of hope your business doesn't exist. I kind of hope people don't want to buy new t-shirts anymore. Isn't it weird to be standing here talking about this when what I'm hoping happens is that there's no demand for your product? And he actually came back and he was like, sometimes when I wake up in the morning, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking, I kind of hope that this wasn't my job or this didn't exist. It's just those conversations are massive, and the future's coming so quickly. And as quick as the advancement of AI, I think it will be a lot of this climate stuff actually that is going to change behaviours inevitably. So a couple of statements. The impact of the Live Nation monopoly on venues was huge a couple of years ago. Has this narrative shifted? In terms of media narrative, it probably amplified a bit last year because the ABC's Four Corners program did a pretty great episode on Live Nation specifically as an example of a multinational company swooping into Australia and other territories and just sort of buying up a big chunk of the sector. They're not the only multinational music organisation to play that role, but that's really interesting to check out if you haven't yet. And another one here says, how do young people discover music? And I guess Christen, or feel free to chime in also, Ollie and Joel. How are young people's behaviours shifting? Because I know anecdotally young people aren't drinking as much alcohol, which is affecting music venues which have completely relied on alcohol for their business models. What are you seeing from research?
Well, this is where I have to be a little bit tantalising, because this is work that is underway at the moment. So this is a research project that's going to come out in 3 stages: early April, late April, and then in June. It's going to look at live attendance, barriers and motivations to attendance at live events. Then the second one will be all about discoverability, how people are finding music. And then the third is consumption, and it kind of ties together a lot of those threads. And this research project has this particular, like, we look at the general population. We've got a whole lot of kind of national level data through which we can do that. But we partnered with Untitled Group, who are festival promoters, and as well as the Daily Oz, like media, youth media, and the Push, and have surveyed them around what do they want, how are they finding music. And so I can't share findings, but I can kind of share some themes, which is what people feel about Australian music isn't always kind of matching what you might see, because also in that report we look at streaming data, right? So you can see how little Australians are listening to Australian music. 9.2% is what Luminate data says about 2024. But then when you do qualitative research with young people and you ask how they feel about Australian music and their commitment to it, it tells a very, very different story. But yes, we know that young people are finding music through streaming, that this is a huge problem because of it's so crowded on streaming service. What is it, 120,000 songs are uploaded a day, apparently. All last year, I think, in each day, that was the same as all the songs released in 1989. So it's kind of everything, everywhere, all at once. And I think about this with my kid, actually. She's not listening to anything new. She's not listening to anything current, and it's because she's listening to everything. She's listening to everything in the 60s and everything in the 70s and everything in the 80s, and then she might be listening to something current, but it's most likely American. So these are some of the things that we're investigating, and another kind of research inquiry in that live music one is about the relationship to the bar. Are people drinking? Are they drinking beforehand? Or are they doing other things? We ask that too, other ways to heighten their experience. So we've got responses to that.
Yeah, I still might have seen a few people doing other things at the festival I was at on the weekend. Having a great time. Okay, I'm going to put something else here. Now, we actually have, you might have seen in an earlier version of the program, we have a late scratching for today's panel, Christy Monfries, who is currently heading up Liquid Architecture, the same organisation that Joel was mentioning before. And I was actually really keen to talk to Christy about her experience in Southeast Asian countries and markets, and because she's got a bit of experience there. But I'm hoping we can have a bit of a chat about it too, because I think we're here to talk about the future of music. I know the Australian music industry has been trying, sometimes half-heartedly, often kind of blindly, to figure out where Australia's place is in what you would say, the Asian music markets are. And there's a lot of complicated, problematic framings that I've just incorporated into the sentence that I said. But I guess for any of you, I'm curious, do you think the next 10 years involves Australia in a more robust, meaningful way, connecting to Southeast Asian audiences or markets or practitioners? Who wants to have a crack?
Your turn.
What do you think, Ollie?
It's a great question.
Should we?
Here's a
different question. A lot of Australian musicians, if they are wanting to, this is maybe on the more contemporary commercial end, but if they want to have a sustainable career where they actually don't have to have a day job, inevitably they have to expand beyond an Australian audience. Yeah. So they either go through a North American pathway or a European pathway. That's traditionally what Australian artists have done. There's a music export body that facilitates that with funding and all sorts of amazing behind-the-scenes wheel greasing. It's a wonderful existing pathway that artists can follow. Doesn't quite exist in Asia. A lot of people figure it out themselves. What do you think we should be figuring out how to move our music into those countries?
Absolutely, that's our regional neighbourhood. So absolutely, I mean that applies to so many aspects of Australia's location in the world. I know people that do that and are brilliant at it, and I know a lot of people who are scratching their heads saying, I just don't have any contacts in Asia. I was born in the UK and moved here when I was 30, so that's where my world is. I performed live music in an electronic music duo, we just had to throw our laptops in our bags and we could get on a Ryanair flight to anywhere in Europe. And so, yeah, don't give me any green credential business. That wasn't.
We'll talk after.
That wasn't a sustainable practice, but it was actually sustainable financially, and it was this incredible difference that my adult life in Australia as a musician has been scratching my head, working out how on earth you even get to the nearest big city from where you are. So, yeah, I think it's a huge thing for Australian musicians to overcome. The simple solution is you move to Berlin or wherever. And I think I would love to see that something that we develop, something that we nurture.
Christen, I know your background is in visual arts.
Yeah, writing about visual arts. I can't draw. But yeah, I did spend time in China writing about the visual arts scene there. And all of my academic studies at that time were in this sort of, not discipline, an area called Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. And the kind of principal argument of that is against the center periphery. And it was established by Asian scholars who realized they'd all met each other, like someone from Vietnam and someone from Indonesia met each other. They met at Stanford or something. Like, why do we have to go to North America or to Western Europe to meet one another? And all of our publications have to go through these kind of sort of geographical points in the hierarchy, like all north. And so it was trying to cultivate that intellectual, not just intellectual collaboration with one's neighbour, but also the development of curiosity, like desire even. And they were really aware of that. They'd say, everyone wants to go to Japan. No one wants to go, no one's thought about the Philippines. Like, how do we cultivate a curiosity about, or even a desire for the aesthetics of this place, or for the history, or for the politics? And I guess, it was kind of pushing against that cultural hegemony or imperialism, really, of the North to Asia. So I was always super motivated by that. So I guess I would say absolutely yes. And then to tie it back to the research that we're doing, I've talked about Illuminate. They kind of put out this streaming data, so you can see who's listening to what, and you can see Australia's listening habits are extremely American and increasingly so. I think that it's hard to compare current streaming data with anything from the 80s or the 90s, because that was everything that was purchased and listened to. That was what was charting. Now, you look at streaming data, you're looking at how AC/DC is doing and how the Beatles is doing, so it's not apples and apples. But it seems to be tending in a mono kind of cultural direction. And yeah, there are others who are writing about this. Tim Kelly from Sony Music, now doing a PhD on this, how our cultural tastes in Australia are becoming more and more American. And I say yes to greater curiosity about our place in the Asia Pacific.
Particularly because our population is increasingly diverse, and we hold multiple diasporas, and we should be proud of that. It's interesting. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I think you said something to me around, from your perspective, visual arts had opened up some of those pathways earlier, and music sort of is behind maybe other artistic disciplines in terms of building a structure, an infrastructure, whether it's contacts or pathways or whatever. Yeah. Why is music behind on this?
I don't know if I had the answer, but I do remember reflecting on that in our kind of pre-meet, that that infrastructure really opened up with China in that first decade of the 21st century, like the 2000s. It was very hot. I mean, money was involved. It was selling really well on the Western European and North American market. So a lot of people went to China. They were drawn there in the same way that people have been drawn to Berlin or LA for the visual arts scene. But it is it's an interesting question. Why?
I wonder,
how's music different?
Is that comparing apples and oranges in the sense that possibly in terms of broader, say, graphic art styles and interests that maybe would be more in a music, more aligned with the music data?
I mean, I can offer a bit of a perspective there. I mean, obviously contemporary art trades on its globality, and it's, if you sort of trying to understand what contemporary art is, it's often defined as art that explores tensions between the global and the local. Yeah. So, in biennales all over the world kind of map the world in a certain way, whereas music is a really different kind of commodity, and one of the main stories of commercial music has been the story of cultural imperialism, of the American domination of popular culture around the world. And now, it's going to bring up Spotify again, but it's like we can't talk about discoverability without talking about algorithmic curation, playlisting, and the way in which, people's tastes are not something that they come to through their subjectivity and like connoisseurship and curiosity and interest, but are often, imposed on them as they sort of interface with different platforms. So platformization has totally changed how we discover music. I mean, that's such an obvious thing to say, but I grew up in the music world in which record stores and community radio stations were the main way that you discovered music. And in a way, I was sort of thankful that I was part of the last sort of offline musical subculture that, the last generation whose sort of subcultural identity was formed offline largely. But maybe I'll also just touch on the question around Southeast Asia, because it is a real shame that Christy Montfries isn't here, because, one of the things she's done with Liquid Architecture in her, position as artistic director, following on from me in that role, is to orient the organisation's whole curatorial focus to Southeast Asia. And that's been a really important thing, because Liquid Architecture is associated with terms like sound art and experimental music, and those terms are a product of 20th century modernist avant-gardes that primarily came out of Europe and the United States. And, like any terminology, part of it is description, but part of it is making a value claim. So the avant-garde, the sound art is sort of like, in some ways, meant to be like somehow more intellectual than music, or more rarefied or whatever. And so it means a lot for those rarefied terms to be associated with European colonial traditions, and for them to exclude, other forms of music from all around the world that are just as intellectual, artistic, experimental in their own ways. So, one of the things Christy's been doing, because she grew up partly in Indonesia, is exploring the deep Indonesian experimental music scene in cities like Bandung and Yogyakarta and Jakarta, and finding, something she already knew, but audiences increasingly in Australia and around the world are finding that there are hundreds of groups, communities, subcultures, DIY scenes making experimental music in those places, in Indonesia and other places in Southeast Asia, that where the artists haven't had the mobility or the platform to share their work internationally, but that's sort of happening more now.
There are plenty of musicians and artists who want to engage more with Southeast Asia because they're interrogating their own personal history, or because they are trying to reframe Australia's geographical place and plug us in, and all of those wonderful things. But there is also, I think, a segment of the music industry that is trying to figure out where the money now comes from, and they see big population numbers and they're just like, how do I get in there? Which I think gets us to money. It's one of my favourite topics. In the future, there'll be no money. We'll just have replicators on our spaceships and we can order Earl Grey tea whenever we want. That's not true.
I think there is interest in Korea, right? The music industry is interested in Korea.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, a lot of our core songwriter or key songwriters are spending lots of time in Korea writing K-pop. Rose, who's one of the biggest pop artists in the world right now, grew up in Melbourne. She went to a high school in Kew. She did that song with Bruno Mars, APT, Uppity. If you've got kids, you know it. But
No, there's a K-pop artist that my kids are really interested in because they went to their school.
That's right. It's genuinely, that is genuine. The K-pop thing in the fandom is genuinely happening.
Yeah, my 7-year-old daughter's favourite artist is Blackpink.
That's it. But so I'm curious. This is again a broad generalisation because I'm not the doctor, so I'm just talking shit basically. But you know, we've seen music just rapidly devalue, particularly on the recorded side, in the last 10 to 15 years, which has caused a lot of consternation in the music industry. And arguably, in some ways, music is a canary in the coal mine for a lot of digital, like the digitalization of art forms. As we head into a future where it's not really obvious where the money comes from, people are paying less money to enjoy music or listen to it. We're having some tricky stuff with our live music scene. Even if we try and look like 50 years into the future, where does the money come from for us to keep making music? Is it some great new capitalist business model that we haven't thought of yet? Is it the government supplies a universal basic income and we all get to just make music? What? Yeah. You know, if you can try and read the tea leaves, what do you think is in the near future, or even in a little bit further down the track? How do we keep making art? Big question.
Yeah, it's a really big question. But I guess technology is making it easier to make art, I guess. So the question is your question really about whether or not, as a kind of professional category or somebody who would earn an income from it? Because you can still, I think people will still be able to make music. People will still be able to write and dance.
So
the
is
question
that the answer?
Is it a kind of occupation?
Yeah, in the future, do we sort of dissolve music as an occupation and it becomes just a practice?
And do audiences become more and more boutique? I mean, I'm doing that, which kind of suggests geographical locality, but they could be like a niche audience all around the world.
I'm drawing heavily on this lecture by a guy called Marek Pollux. He has a podcast called Disintegrator that I listened to recently. It was one of the best diagnoses of the political economy of music that I've encountered in a long time. But, you know, and there'd be much better sort of Marxists in the audience than me, but, you know, one of the things that he said is that once something has been decommoditized, like, and sort of like no longer has value, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. So if people are used to getting music for free, then getting them to sort of reinventing music as a commodity that people will pay for is tricky. He had another statistic that I think is kind of relevant, which is Spotify did an internal study and found that only 200,000 people on their platform are making enough money from royalties to be viable professional musicians. And considering that most viable professional musicians are probably on Spotify, that could be a global figure, 200,000, right? Which contrasts against another figure, which is there are 7 million professional influencers in the United States alone. So the idea was then that music becomes something that doesn't have value on its own terms as sort of music, but becomes sort of instrumental in other things like selling products, like for its cultural capital, you know, functional spaces. So I think this is really the problem, is this sort of devaluing of music as a commodity in and of itself, and its absorption into other platforms, other logics, and I'm not sure how we come back from maybe universal basic income or the dissolution of music as a category, but yeah.
Any thoughts, Ollie?
I think it has to be a pluralist approach. I think that copyright has been the de facto way that people survive on music, along with live music, and probably more so live music, and that thankfully isn't quite so obviously under threat by things like AI. It might be under threat by other things. There's a lot of potential forks in the road. One of the things that's happening with or without AI is, and has always happened, is this sort of distinction between whether a musician gets a flat fee for something or not. So one of the scandals around Spotify has been that a jazz musician could be making an album of their own expression that they put on Spotify and make money from, but it turns out that jazz musician has been kind of co-opted to be paid a flat fee to go and make a smooth listening jazz album that goes on a playlist that gets bumped up, and that's where they end up getting their money. So they've been sort of disempowered, alienated from the sort of potential revenue of their creative production. So that's always something to keep an eye on. But I've always been a bit of a Spotify cynic, a bit of a copyright cynic. It's a kind of blunt instrument. If you think about music in really simple terms as this kind of wealth inequality graph that looks like a hockey stick, and you've got some very, very famous people over here, and most of us over here, including the chunk of people that don't even get their Spotify royalties because they're in the under 1,000 plays category, very long flat tail. And you ask the question, where's the survival line? Where's the line that we can draw that is the difference between having a professional income and not? An interesting question is the fact that you can move that line around, you can flatten that curve, and we certainly should, and be more socialist. But you'll always have this sort of edge case, and that edge case will never go away. And I think that's an interesting problem to really engage with, because there's some very interesting research, like Gross and Musgrove's great book, Can Music Make You Sick? And it's a study into the mental health effects of people having to constantly self-promote, and the sort of culture you enter into when you sort of make that commitment to be a professional artist of any kind. So we need to be aware that we've got this kind of carrying capacity for professional artists, but we've always got that sort of edge case. And then, of course, we've got all of the questions of inclusion and equity and diversity that we have to add into that as well, because those people are not just stats, they're from different backgrounds. And, so pluralist approach, we need governments to recommit to funding the arts, we need copyright to work as best as it can and be equitable, and we need live music.
I love that you touched on the problematic nature of copyright. That's a whole other talk, is what do we do, what does it look like if not copyright? Might be a bit late, some of the movement on that, but and also, thank you for shouting out that book. I can highly recommend that book. It had a huge effect on me. It is kind of devastating to read. Can Music Make You Sick?
I found it quite almost empowering, in the sense that you suddenly go, oh yeah, I am just a sort of cultural product of my time. And
yes, although I gave it to friends who couldn't finish it because it was so confronting to them. Because the book essentially, it aims to try and explain why the rates of anxiety and depression in musicians, whether they're successful or not, just people who identify as artists, is so much higher than the general population. And they make a pretty good case that it's not that artists are unique snowflakes. Like artists are sensitive, but it's actually a whole bunch of, it's the working conditions that musicians are generally under. And also, crucially, the artist narrative, the way in music in particular, I feel like musicians often internalize quite dangerous narratives around what success looks like, what their identity is, relationship with social media, and how they're expected to behave on these platforms has only exacerbated what was already a bit of a problem in music. So for anyone curious about that intersection of arts and mental health, it's a really great book. So thank you for mentioning that. A few questions, because we are coming up, so we've got like 7 minutes, it says here. So if you've got a last minute question you want to throw in, please throw it in, because I reckon we'll do a bit of questions from you all now. Someone did ask me, can we listen to the Suno song that you prompted earlier? Yeah, I was... I mean, we've all heard them, right? But like, I was going to, but then it said sign in, and I don't want to sign in to anything I don't have to. If you are wanting to make inroads and networks into Asia, come to Asiatopa in a couple of weeks' time. I'll give you that's a plug. You got it? You got your plug wherever you are. Somebody else also asks, what's the future like for music programs in theatre? Not quite sure what that question might be in regards to, but does anyone want to have a crack at answering that? That's not my background, but music in theatre. That might be a separate convo if someone wants to come and talk to us a bit later about that. Send through your questions now. In the meantime, I want to go back to... I want to talk about this artist narrative, actually. I'm curious what you guys think about this, whether you think that that's a bit of a provocation from me, that I think the artist narrative is more prevalent in music and that it doesn't help. I spend a lot of time with artists at a community level, and trying to remind them that they don't need to be famous. They might actually have quite a happy life if they just engage with their communities and treat music as a personal practice and a communal practice. Do you think there are unhealthy narratives around success and artistry in music specifically that you see, any of you?
I'm still thinking about it, but I will just note Support Act started as a service for the music industry, and now it's expanded. But it's kind of interesting that that's where it began.
Yeah, so I saw that. They've recently, they're now, it's open to any cultural worker, any creative worker, and that's not just artists, it's anyone working across the art forms. Always good to throw that in. If you're here and you represent an organisation, you work with a bunch of people in culture or the arts, Support Act has a 24-hour helpline, and they have amazing resources online. So if there's one thing you go back to your work lives with from this panel, it's that the people that you work with who might be in need have a resource that they can rely on. Thank you for bringing that up.
Is it also fair to ask, well, it's just a question, of all the art forms, is music the one that kind of holds up youth the most?
Yeah.
Which would add to the anxiety.
Yeah, how so would it add to the anxiety? Not that I just...
Because you're aging every day, and so you worry about your currency. I've had those conversations with friends who are big in their 20s, and then they've had a kid, and then they're in the late 30s, and it's a huge act of repositioning, really kind of public cultural act of re-identifying, and it doesn't always work. And sometimes it does, but it's huge work, and yeah, I don't imagine a visual artist, or perhaps an actor, but there is, youth and live music culture is quite intimately bound up.
Yeah, the idea in visual art that you would make your best work when you're 27 and then maybe you don't need to worry about it after that would be ridiculous.
And
right?
authors, we see, authors, the average age of an author is always higher than the other art forms.
Yeah, sorry, Ollie.
Well, so of course, just to riff off that, the sort of role of music in social identity and identity formation, there's a wonderful body of research about this sort of these associations and the way that we adopt music in a relational way with other people, and I think that's really, just to bring it back to the thinking around AI and what people want from music. Making something that's distinct, that's unique, that's yours is very commonly articulated as something that we're trying to do when we create to assert identity in various ways, and to associate with other people or to disassociate with other people. And AI is an interesting frontier for that, because it potentially sort of eradicates the potential to do that through the fact that you're not the one doing the expression, it's the system doing the expression. But of course, potentially it can completely empower that, in the sense that we probably will have cultures of AI music that arise and that are fast moving, and us oldies will all look at them and go, "My God!"
we already do.
We already do, yeah.
And I just want to mention Brian Eno. not because he has
obligatory Brian Eno mention.
That's an in-joke. No, because he not that he has anything to do with this answer. It's just that he was mentioned repeatedly in yesterday's panels. So me and Ollie said that we would mention Brian Eno. So, and
can you mention what shirt he likes to wear?
We actually wanted to make a Brian Eno diss track on Suno and play it, but you'll just have to imagine that.
We were too lazy, basically.
We were too, It was too much work to make it on Suno. If we talk about musicians, being anxious and stressed, and music making you sick, obviously the traction in saying that is that what we mostly think about music is that it brings joy, and pleasure and connection, and that is true about music, and it's also what makes it such a seductive commodity and what makes it so appealing to capital. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's why Spotify are one of the biggest companies in the world, because we love music. They don't love music. In fact, music, royalties are their biggest cost, and they would like to reduce that by generating their own artists and fake AI tracks to replace real musicians on their platform. So, but as listeners, we do love music, and that love of music is often used to kind of pull us onto platforms, pull us into infrastructures that we would rather not be in, and we go there because we're following the thing that we love. So, like, one of the questions is how to reclaim space for engaging with this thing that we love, but within infrastructures and platforms and economies that are sustainable and that we can support.
We landed on love. Couldn't have scripted it better. We landed on the love of music. Yep. I just want to, while I'm thinking of it, for anyone who is curious about Spotify, I think potentially the definitive book on Spotify from a lot of these perspectives has recently been released. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but I've followed the authors.
The Liz Pelly one?
The Liz Pelly book. I've followed her writing for a long time. And I'm looking forward to reading it, but if you're particularly concerned about some of the things we've raised around Spotify, she's coming at it from all angles in the new book. I want to thank our wonderful, smart guests. Can you please give them a round of applause?